Hi, my name's Paul Long. I've done some extensive research into the new GCSEs in Computer Science that will first be examined in summer 2022. I focused specifically on the three English exam boards of AQA, Edexcel and OCR. First though, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about myself. So my background, most importantly, is that I've been a computing teacher. 23 years of experience at both ICT and computer science. I've written a number of different textbooks for CUP and for HODA, and also self-published resources. I've been a principal examiner for 2 exam boards across 4 different specifications. I'm an off-qual subject expert, and I'm also a subject matter expert for the National Centre for Computing Education, and I also facilitate training for them through STEM learning. I'm self-employed. I produce resources that I sell directly to school. I run revision sessions and training for teachers, and I also do the freelance training that I've just mentioned. But that's not what I'm here to sell you anything today. This is just purely about what GCSEs are available and which one would be best for your students. You'll be making the decision, not me. So anything that we've discussed today, you'll find further information on my website at www.gcsecs.org. On there you'll find a full detailed evaluation that goes into much more depth than what I'm going to do today, and also an interactive spreadsheet so you can compare the specifications side by side, and a transition guides if you're moving from the old GCSE to the new GCSE for each of the individual exam boards. Just to quickly show you what that actually looks like, so if you type in that web address, this is the web page you'll get to, and if you just come down to this bit where it says free offers, you'll see that there's a link there. Click on this and you'll find there the documents that I've just been talking about. So here's the evaluation of the new specifications, and that looks like this. It's pretty much finalised now. It's gone through a number of different revisions as the specifications have evolved, but now it's there, and it goes through and discusses all the different important aspects that we're going to look at today in some depth. And if you were to select, for example, one of the transition guides, you would come across this. This is the OCR one. And what this will do is it will take you through all the important changes that you need to know, but most importantly, the changes to the actual subject content. Now, this has been done in both the new specification order and in the old specification order, so you can look at it from either perspective. If we just go in and have a quick look, you'll see on here that this is the new specification on the left-hand side, and on the right hand side is the old specification. And you will see that anything that is new is highlighted in green. Anything where there's been a slight change but it doesn't necessarily affect much has been put in orange. And where there's anything that's been removed, then you'll find that in red. Okay, so if we have a look here, for example, extended ASCII has been removed from the old J276 specification. So this will just help you to update your teaching notes that you've developed over the last few years if you are transitioning from one of the old specifications. Let's get back to what we're looking at. I will talk about the spreadsheet a little bit later on, but we'll go in and have a look now at some information about the specifications. So first of all, why are the specifications changing? Well, the non-exam assessment, the NEA, had already been replaced with the programming project. The programming project was a temporary measure because things had gone a bit wrong with the NEA. As teachers had predicted and had told Ofqual and the government and everybody that this would happen, the NEA, the restrictions that were put on it and the way that it had been put in place wasn't going to work. It was never going to be able to keep all these different projects secret, etc. And things went wrong, particularly with one of the exam boards where one of the projects was released online, and so it was replaced with a programming project. This is a temporary measure, as I say. It meant that the qualification moved to 100% exams, and that the programming project had to be done over a period of 20 hours. So that was the first thing that happened. But that was only a temporary measure. So as a permanent measure, they've now brought in new specifications that resolve those problems, but also have given exam boards the opportunity to update their subject content. So let's start by having a look at what is the same for each of the exam boards. First of all, there's no programming project. None of them require a programming project to be done, but we'll talk about programming in a bit. It's 100% examination, and all exam boards have got 2 exam papers that are worth 50% each. One will be focused on programming and one is focused on other topics. In terms of programming, students are required during their course of study to design, write, test and refine programs. That can be done in whatever way suits your students and your teaching style. All you have to do is produce a practical programming statement to confirm that students have had the opportunity to do this. And then the programming will be examined in some form through an exam, which we'll have a look at in a minute. About 75% of the subject content, in fact more, I'm being conservative there in estimating that, it's probably closer to 80 to 90% of the subject content is the same for all the exam boards. But each has got its own little differences that they've brought in. Okay, so let's have a look at the programming in terms of what was done in programming before and what will be done in programming now. So in the old specifications, which are still being taught by the way for your current year 11, we're only focusing on the new year 10. So for the old specifications, there was a project that students had to do. They had to go through a process of analysis and evaluation. There would be an iterative process and having to screenshot all sorts of things that they'd done. A time allowance which was 20 hours, it had to be supervised, although this year for year 11, because of the coronavirus interruption, it has no longer got to be supervised, but it is recommended that you still provide some class time to help students with this, because programming will still be examined. And it was set by the exam board. It was also checked by the exam board and moderated, although again this year it won't be for the final run through of year 11. Now it's replaced by programming tasks, and as I mentioned a moment ago, you have to provide the opportunities for students to design, write, test and refine. This doesn't need to be a single task. It can be a variety of different tasks throughout the course. You choose how you're going to deliver it, and you have to then sign a practical programming statement to confirm that that has been done. But you wouldn't want to teach this qualification without doing those things anyway, because students wouldn't be able to attempt the programming exam if they hadn't done those things. So let's have a look at the programming exam. Let's have a look at the differences between each of the exam boards. So AQA and Edexcel, it's both 2 hours long. OCR's is 1.5 hours. Their marks are pretty much very similar, 75, 80, 90. More marks gives more opportunity for differentiation more than anything, but it's not a massive difference here. The biggest difference of a programming exam is whether it is an on-screen exam or whether it's a paper exam. Edexcel are the only one of these 3 exam boards that offer an on-screen exam. Now, before you start getting worried and thinking, oh, I've got to have online software, what happens if the internet goes down while it's happening and so on, it's an on-screen exam, it's not online. This means that all you need to have installed is Python, and then they'll be able to go through and complete the tasks. So it needs nothing more than that. It can be done on a very basic computer. OCR and AQA will both do their programming on paper. So students will have to do their programming on paper and write it out and remember it. There won't be any trial and error in that sense. Whereas with Edexcel, they'll be able to try it, see if it runs, see if it works, and go for it that way. You can choose which IDE you want to use, and you can choose the offline help that's going to go with it as well, as long as it's the offline help that comes with that IDE. Therefore, your choice of IDE could be influenced by what offline help there is available, but it must use Python version 3. Edexcel have also provided what's called a programming language subset. This is a subset of Python that they will use for asking questions, and all questions will be able to be answered using that programming language subset. So in other words, this tells you the extent to which you've got to teach. As long as you've taught all of those programming concepts within the PLS, then your students will be fine. It doesn't stop them from going beyond the PLS to answer an exam question. Their syntax must be correct. Whereas for OCR and AQA, because it's a paper-based exam, they will forgive minor syntax errors. But of course, with Edexcel, students can try it out and they'll be able to see whether their syntax is working or not. Now, with AQA, they'll be looking at algorithms and programming only, and same with OCR, but they will draw on other knowledge from other aspects of the course as well. But the real focus will be on algorithms and programming. Edexcel will just be the programming. So things like your bubble sorts will be focused in paper 1 rather than their paper 2 programming paper. OCR, students can use any high-level language or OCR's exam reference language. Talk about that in a second. AQA, students can choose either Python, C# or VB.NET. Now, it's important that when you enter your students, and the first entries for summer 2022, so you'll be doing early 2022, you'll be entering your students, that you choose which one of those you want your students to do. All your students don't have to do the same one. You can have different students doing different entry. Now, OCR use what's called an exam reference language. Now, I like this term. It's better than the old pseudocode term that they used to use. Basically, it's like a high-level language that they've written. There's no interpreter or compiler for it, but it's what they use for asking exam questions. It's quite similar to Python in a lot of ways, but students can also use it to answer the questions. So that can be helpful in that sense. AQA use what's called their pseudocode. Now, I don't like the term pseudocode because pseudocode shouldn't have any sort of structure. But really, it's what they're using as their reference language. So it's what they use for asking questions, and specifically for asking questions regarding algorithms. Okay, sorry about the little pause. I'm just waiting for my screen to catch up. So if we just focus on Edexcel's first of all, and then we'll have a look at OCR and AQA. So I mentioned theirs is an on-screen exam, and it's got to be Python. Now that might put off a handful of schools, but the vast majority of schools are using Python. Questions will include tasks that require students to refine existing code that will be provided by AQA as PY files, testing existing code, or correcting existing code, or even writing new code. The files that are provided will either be Python code or text files, which could include comma-separated files as well. I see this as a realistic programming experience, although you can't obviously ask for help and assistance, but you can get the debugging done. You know if your programs are going to work. And as I mentioned, all questions will be within the scope of their programming language subset, so you know what aspects of Python you've got to teach. Now with OCR, they've got two languages that you can use, a high-level language of the student's choice or the exam reference language. So all questions will be asked in either, before I go on to that, let's talk about sections A and B, because this does cause quite a bit of confusion. So we'll have a look at section A first of all. This is where any questions there could be asked in natural English, OCR's exam reference language, or flowcharts. And in terms of how students answer it, unless it specifically asks them, so for example, ask them for a flowchart, if it asks to produce an algorithm, they can use any of these, pseudocode, flowcharts, bullet points, ERL, high-level language, whichever one they choose. Section B, however, requires specific responses in different circumstances. And each question will build upon the previous question, so students will have had to have understood the question before moving on to the question after. Now, this is a screenshot on the right is taken directly from OCR's specification because this explains how they will ask questions in section B. So, for example, if a question is about writing some code, they might ask the question using pseudocode, natural English or a flowchart, and they would expect candidates to respond using their ERL or high-level programming language. Now on the surface this looks quite complicated because you're thinking, well, students have got to remember what they've got to do. OCR have promised that they will make it clear in section B which method students have got to use to answer the question. We'll only be able to see that once the exams start to come out though. So let's have a look at AQA's programming exam. Students will need to be familiar with two languages, one of either Python, C# or VB.NET, depending which pathway they've chosen, and AQA's pseudocode, effectively their reference language. Now it is a bit unclear what AQA's pseudocode will be used for. Some questions in the sample paper use the pseudocode and some use Python, C# or VB.NET, depending on the pathway. My prediction looking at it and looking at the way they've asked the questions is that it would be pseudocode that would be used for the algorithm questions, like things like bubble sorts, etc. And it would be their Python, C# or VB.NET for specific programming questions. The programming questions must be answered in the programming language of the student's choice. They cannot use pseudocode for answering the programming questions. And just a note that SQL that they've included will be tested in the non-programming exam paper, so do watch out for that. Having looked at the different ways that the exam boards are running their tests, one of the questions you need to ask yourselves is, can your centre run an on-screen test? If you can, then Edexcel is one of the ones that you'd want to consider. If you don't feel that you can run the on-screen test, then you'd be choosing between AQA and OCR. Now remember, there's no special software required. They just need a UIDE for Python, including the offline help, and the PY and text files will be provided by Edexcel. There's no internet connection required at all. In fact, it must be disallowed, disconnected. Do read Edexcel's ICE document, their instruction for conducting exams, and have a look at that. But so a couple of questions to ask yourself, or one really to start with. Can you accommodate a distance between computers of 1.25 meters, or use screen dividers? Have a look at JCQ, the Joint Council for Qualifications, their ICE document in Appendix 1. But it doesn't have to be a distance between computers. It's actually a distance between students and the computers. So you could use every other computer, for example. Or if you put screen dividers in, then have a look at JCQ about how that can be used. And they're quite simple to put in place. You can get your D&T department to help with that, maybe. You can have your candidates in several different rooms. They do not all need to be in the same room. They don't need to be in a hall. So if you've got 30 candidates and you've got 2 rooms with 15 computers in each, then you can do that across 2 rooms. You'd have 2 invigilators. You should not, as a teacher, be present. You don't need to be, and you shouldn't be. Invigilators will be supervising the exams. You should have technical support available in case something goes wrong with one of the computers and students need it restarting or something like that. But you don't need to be involved, you don't need to be there. Consider as well, if you've got a large cohort, let's say you've got 90 students and you think, well, I can't actually get all 90 students into computer rooms at the same time. That's not a problem, because you can schedule your sessions like 2 or 3 sessions a day. You could have an early morning session, a late morning session, an early afternoon session, an early evening session, for example. As long as your centre abides by the JCQ ICE timetable variation tools, which your exams officer will be very familiar with, then it's not a problem. This happens with exam clashes, so it happens all the time. Let's have a look next at the non-programming papers. So they're all around an hour and a half, but AQA's is slightly longer, an hour and 45. Same breakdown of marks of 75, 80 and 90. In terms of the long answer question, the question where students have got to answer almost like an essay, and where it's that one that a lot of centres dread, isn't it? But if we actually have a look at it, Edexcel's is 6 marks, so that's less than 10% of the exam paper. OCR's is 8 marks, that's 10% of the exam paper. AQA's is 9 marks, that's 10% of the exam paper. So it shouldn't be anything to be completely scared of, because it is only one question. But it is one single question that does attract a lot of marks, and if it's a topic students are struggling with, it can cause some problems. Edexcel has structured their question paper so that there are 5 compulsory questions for students to answer. There will be 1 for each of their 5 topics except programming. And basically what they'll do is each of those questions is broken down into like A, B, C, D. So it's not like one long question. It's actually a set of questions on each topic. AQA will also include their SQL questions in this paper rather than on the programming paper. Now I've called this slide accessibility. What I'm looking at here is how accessible is the exams for the students. One of the things that I always like to look at are command words. These are the words that start exam questions like write, discuss, explain, describe, state. Now Edexcel have restricted their command words to 13. I like that because students haven't got to learn lots of different command words and how they have to go about answering those questions. One of my bugbears about exams is the different command words that are used. I wish it would be the same for every exam in every subject, and that students didn't have to learn a different way of answering questions based on how the command word is done. But unfortunately we're in an age where each exam board and each subject within each exam board can set its command words however it wants to. So Edexcel has got a set of 13. OCR's got a set of 29. I think that's rather a lot. AQA haven't given any command word guidance yet, but their previous specification had 15 command words. So it might be that we can go based on that, but we just do not know. Now, Edexcel had problems with their old 1CP1 specification. Questions were badly worded, the specification wasn't written brilliantly, but they have made some really big changes. They've recognised all these issues. They've changed the style of the questions completely, and they've also changed their specification. They've restructured it, and it is much clearer, and they've created a detailed getting started guide that expands on all the specification points, and it's actually clearer than any of the other 2 exam boards, whereas before it was the most vague of all of them, and I'd have never recommended Edexcel before, but now they're looking quite strong. OCR, they tend to ask more contextual questions. That means like they might say an estate agent has a network of computers, and then students have got to answer within that context. This obviously requires a bit of understanding beyond computer science, and it can add some ambiguity into the question. I do find that sometimes OCR can be a bit more rigid with the mark schemes. Once they've decided what their allowed answers are going to be, they tend not to be as flexible. So if they find a month into the marking process a student has come up with a good answer but it's not been allowed on the mark scheme, they won't add it in and allow it. AQA, their questions tend to be very clear, very concise, and very little ambiguity. I like that. That is how exam papers should be written. They also have a flexible approach to their mark scheme, in that if students do come up with valid correct answers that they haven't recognised early on in the process when they're setting up the mark scheme that will be used by examiners, then they will allow those correct answers. AQA's specification has always had clear additional information, although it's not as clear as this new Edexcel's guide. OCR never had any additional explanation, and it was a very vague specification last year. They've now put in some extra guidance, although there are still a few ambiguities. But OCR, to be fair, do answer the questions if you've got them about that, and they've answered my questions. If we actually look at the subject content for each of the exam boards, so Edexcel is the lightest on the content, so that means you haven't got to teach as wide a breadth of content as the other exam boards. OCR have got a pretty good balance in terms of the subject content. AQA, I don't know what they've done, they've gone a bit heavy on it this time around. They're putting quite a few extra things. And if we have a look at some examples, so AQA have got quite a lot of these additional challenges, such as Huffman trees, run length encoding, that's not too bad. SQL insert, which OCR have got SQL select, Edexcel don't do any SQL, but AQA have gone for SQL select, insert, update and delete, which is, I don't understand why. Relational databases as well, none of the other two exam boards require that. Creating Boolean expressions for a logic circuit, and converting bitmap into binary data, which was fine when it was two colours and therefore 1 bit. But now they haven't got a limit on the colour depth. The colour depth isn't limited to 1 bit. I would hope they never go beyond 2 or 3 bits of colour depth, but their specification has allowed them to, so it's a bit awkward. OCR, their additional challenges, I've got the insertion sort, not too bad. Virtual memory, again, not too bad. Client server and peer-to-peer networks, can cause a bit of confusion sometimes, but it's not something that can't be overcome. SQL injection, that is quite tricky to understand for students, but there have to be some things that challenge students as well. And they have avoided the challenge as well in terms of the TCP/IP model. Students don't need to know what each of the different layers are and what they do. They just need to understand the need for different layers. However, if I was teaching this, I couldn't teach that without teaching the different layers anyway. But the point is, students haven't got to remember the 4 layers. For Edexcel, probably the hardest thing they've added in as additional challenges is the passing of data through registers using the little man machine. Signed binary integers, so negative binary integers, although they have removed the just a plain sign magnitude and they're just sticking with 2's complement. Base 2 versus base 10 kilobytes and kibibytes, but it's worth knowing that. It's a good thing to teach students. Measuring network speeds, that's not too difficult. Comma separated files, OCR and AQA have said they won't be using them because of course their ERL doesn't allow for that. However, Edexcel will be, but of course students will be using a real programming environment, so we'll be able to use them in that environment. Some challenges that Edexcel have avoided though. You don't need to do any denary to hex conversion. You don't need to create or modify logic circuit diagrams, don't need to know about ROM, and don't need to know about cloud storage. So on these next few slides, what I've got is the new content that's been put into each of the exams. Now I'm not going to go through these slides. If you want to pause the video and have a look, feel free, or you can download this presentation from my website www.gcsecs.org, or go to paullong.net and then select the GCSE Computer Science option, and you'll then be able to follow the link. We've got a couple of slides for AQA, and then I also looked at the content that will be removed. I'm just going through these a little bit so that you can actually see them and pause them in time. And then we've got some more new stuff for Edexcel, notably their new flowchart single for subprograms, which isn't a bad thing at all. And then the content of Edexcel have removed. And as you can see, Edexcel have removed the most content of all the exam boards. They've removed a lot of those things that were a bit complex to teach and test. And then we've got OCR's new content and the content that OCR has removed. As you can see, there's a reasonable balance there with OCR. So this slide now is about the responsiveness of the exam board. So when I was conducting my research, this was how well did the exam boards engage, not just with me, but also with the whole evaluation process and with teachers. So in terms of engagement, OCR engaged, they engaged reasonably well. Edexcel engaged in most of the evaluation process. They gave me lots of feedback. They also addressed issues that I had spotted with their first draft and other teachers had spotted, and they addressed that and corrected a lot of it and changed a lot of it in response to that feedback. OCR did give feedback on my comparison documents, and they did address some of the issues that were raised in a public consultation, and eventually they did actually produce a version 2 of their specification which addressed a few of the issues I had spotted during my research as well. So it's good to see that OCR and Edexcel engaged there. Edexcel even went as far as to provide an early draft for me of their Getting Started guide. I gave them feedback and they responded to that feedback very positively. What I didn't get from OCR was that opportunity to comment on their first draft of their specification or anything. It was just like the rest of the public, which is fine, that's up to them. AQA, I don't know why, but they have chosen not to engage with the evaluation process at all. They haven't responded to queries and questions and requests for further information. They didn't provide any opportunity for feedback on a first draft of their specification. They just put it out there. And actually they've been a bit obstructive as well, which has been a shame, because they prevented me from putting up a direct comparison of the learning objectives from their specification. They've got their copyright rules, but it was a real shame because it means a lot of extra work from teachers if they want to extract that subject content, because I can't include it on the Word document that I put on my website. Or so it's a PDF of the Word document. So in terms of what support are you going to get from the exam boards? First of all, in terms of textbooks, all your well-known computer science authors and publishers are providing resources for them. I always recommend your independent providers and publishers. Remember, an author of the big publishers only gets 10% of the royalties, and if there's two authors, they only get 5%. Most of it's going into big profits of big companies. So do support your independent suppliers as well, like myself, for example, Craig and Dave, Test and Track, and there are others out there as well. Edexcel has produced some transition documents so that if you are moving from 2016 GCSE, either Edexcel, OCR or AQA, to their new qualification, and then they've got some transition documents to that, which is really good if you're moving to them. They've got a launch presentation. It's on their website and a scheme of work on their website. They're also producing an interactive scheme of work. They're planning for a lot of more future support documents, and I know that they are mapping all the resources that all your suppliers have produced, because I've been asked to provide that information, as are people like Craig and Dave, John Philip Jones, NCCE, etc. And they're going to put all of that there to show how their specification matches to those resources. OCR have got a scheme of work on their website, and other website documents they've got. For example, they've got a selection of teaching guides, teacher delivery packs. They've got promotional material that you can use for option evenings, and a guide to the exam papers as well. AQA support documents require an eAQA login, so you'd need to speak to your exams officer about getting one of those. But there are only 4 short documents that are available publicly. And if you're looking for the pseudocode, it's in the document called Subject Specific Vocabulary. So at first I couldn't actually find it, and it wasn't until one of their examiners showed me where it was. I want to just talk a little bit about grade boundaries. I often hear teachers saying, oh, well, I've chosen this exam board because it's got the lowest grade boundaries. I don't want you to choose an exam board based on whether their grade boundaries are the lowest or something. Let's have a look at why. A lower grade boundary does not mean that you're going to get more grade 9s. If we have a look at this graph on the right, so you've got your average total mark grade boundaries here for each of the exam boards. You can see that this is with the old exam. I expect the new exam there will all be, it will be quite similar. I think AQAs will come down quite a bit because they've made their papers a lot more difficult now. I think Edexcels will come back more into the norm. But as you can see, Edexcel had the lowest exam boundaries in the old specification. AQA had the highest. But then when you look at the percentage of students that achieve each grade, they're pretty much exactly the same. The difference is negligible. So your grade boundaries do not make a difference to the number of your students that are going to get grade 9, grade 8, grade 7, etc. What a lower grade boundary means is that the questions have been set too hard, or that the mark scheme has been set too strictly. There should be a fair balance of marks awarded to each grade, and questions should be targeted and differentiated so that they give different students a chance to show their abilities. If you've got higher grade boundaries, then you've got more accessible questions. Now you can see this with the old AQA exam papers. I said earlier about how their questions are clear and concise, and you can see therefore you've got the higher grade boundaries, and you've also got a really nice differentiation, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now bear in mind these graphs are based on the old specifications. The new specs will be different. AQA have added in a lot more new difficult topics. Edexcel have sorted out all the issues that they had with their previous paper, and so I think Edexcel is going to be very similar to OCR's blue line, and AQA is probably going to come somewhere between Edexcel's green line and OCR's blue line. That's just a prediction for me, but it may not be correct or true. It's just me using my experience to make an estimated guess. So I just slightly missed the slide there, so we'll just come back. So in terms of differentiation, what we're looking at for differentiation is how well have the exams been written to distribute the grades from 1 to 9. Okay, so this is the difference, and what I'm looking at here is the difference between the grade 1 boundary and the grade 9 boundary. Now the wider that difference, the more differentiated the exam is, and the more marks available for each grade, and it makes it less risky that a student is going to be dropping a whole grade because they've lost a couple of marks. It still can happen, but it's less risky because there's a wider distribution of marks. Now this is based on the old specifications, and I think it will be very different for the new specifications. I think AQA is going to be a bit more bunched up because they've got the harder topics, a lot more of those topics. I think Edexcel is now going to start to spread out, particularly with their on-screen programming exam, and that's going to be good. And OCR, I would expect to stay around about the same because they haven't made major differences. Each of the exam boards have got a few what I call misconceptions, and this is where they've not quite understood some of the terms correctly. And it's one of these things where often it's something where misconception has come about at some point and it's ended up in textbooks and then it gets repeated on websites and then it gets believed to be true. All of them can be overcome, but just so you're aware, Edexcel use the term iteration to only mean an iteration of a data structure. Now in Python, yes, you iterate over an iterable. So even if you're doing a for loop, for example, and you're going through a for loop, then in Python you are iterating over a range. So like in range 0, 9, which would give you effectively an array of the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. However, iteration doesn't apply just to that. Iteration applies to loops, not just data structures. So using repetition as a separate term for loops isn't technically correct. I don't think it's going to cause any major problems though. OCR have used the term erroneous test data and have defined it differently to invalid test data. They're actually exactly the same thing, but the guidance column suggests that erroneous data is data of the incorrect type. Well, actually, data of the incorrect type is invalid as well. It's just a type check when you're doing your validation. And the guidance column suggests that test data would always be of the correct type, okay, but outside the boundaries for invalid data. Well, that's correct, but it doesn't have to be of the correct type. Right? If it's of the incorrect type, that's also invalid, but it's on a type check. Now, OCR have addressed this issue by saying that they will allow the terms to be used interchangeably by students and they won't penalise them for the use of one term over the other. What worries me is that they have left it in their specification. AQA have used the term sample resolution for their sound definitions instead of bit depth. Now, sample resolution, the term has evolved over time and it no longer has any sort of precise definition, and bit depth is the industry standard definition. So if you were teaching this, you would just need to teach students that sample resolution isn't really the correct term. So what we've got now is a quick summary of the different exam boards and the things that I've talked about, and this is what my recommendations would be. So Edexcel, they've got your on-screen programming exam, a clearly detailed specification, particularly with the Getting Started guide. They only use Python, and there's no extra exam reference language to learn. OCR is paper-based programming exam, reasonably detailed specification. Students can use any high-level language, but they need to learn an exam reference language as well. And of all the exams, it's the shortest one. AQA, paper-based programming exam like OCR, very clearly defined specification. Students choose one of 3 languages to use, but they also need to know AQA's pseudocode, which is effectively their reference language, and it's the longest of the 3 exam boards of the exams. My personal opinion is that I would recommend Edexcel if you prefer the on-screen exam. I find that their specification is so clear and concise, and it's cut down on a lot of the content. If you can't do an on-screen exam, or you prefer a paper-based exam, then my recommendation would be for OCR. I used to recommend AQA because they had got a very clear, defined specification. But now, because of the way they've introduced a lot of extra content, I would only recommend it for your higher ability learners and if you're going on to do A-level. However, my point has always been that GCSE, whilst it is a preparation for A-level and your teaching may start to prepare from the A-level, the assessment shouldn't be preparing them for A-level. The assessment should be at level 2 and shouldn't be preparing them for questions that might appear at level 3. So if you want further information on this, go to my website. You'll find the full detailed evaluation. I showed you that at the beginning. Click on the link for free offers that you can just see over here. You'll see there's an interactive spreadsheet as well, which I've just shown on there. I'll come back to that in a moment. You'll also see transition guides for moving from AQA's old to AQA's new, Edexcel's old to Edexcel's new, OCR's old to OCR's new. And this is also my website where I supply my own resources, but I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm here to just help you make the right choice of your exams. So I said I'd show you the interactive spreadsheet very briefly. So this is what it looks like. The first worksheet has got a set of instructions and guidance as to how it can be used, about how you can sort and how you can filter the document, and it tells you what each one of them is. There's also a link that takes you to each of these tabs. So if we have a look at the first one, this is all the specification content. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this, especially if you're watching this on your mobile phone. Unless you've got like a large screen TV, you wouldn't be able to. But of course, we can zoom in if we want to. But I'm just zooming out just so you can see how extensive it is, that it covers all 3 exam boards. And what I can do, for example, if I want to sort by Edexcel's codes, and I sort by Edexcel, okay, what I will now see, okay, first of all, is all the content that Edexcel don't cover that the other exam boards do. Okay, so you can now see what Edexcel aren't covering, but what AQA and OCR are covering. Then what you'll see is, as we get to Edexcel specification, and we'll just ignore the ones in brackets, that's all explained in the instructions, it now goes in order through Edexcel specification. So you can follow that, and you can see then, by looking at it from Edexcel's point of view, how OCR and AQA can compare. And of course, I can do exactly the same with AQA. So if I sort by AQA, it will start off by looking at what AQA doesn't cover, but what the other exam boards do. So here there's some content that OCR covers that AQA doesn't, and then a little bit that Edexcel covers that AQA doesn't, and then it'll get into AQA's content. This tab here, the 2022 codes only, is just a mapping document. So this shows you how each of the topics, and I put the topics in my own personal order, although they tend to follow OCR's sort of structure because they've got quite a nice structure to their specification. But what you can do is you can then quickly cross-reference and see where AQA is teaching something, what the same reference would be for Edexcel. And then at the end, you've got each of the exam board's specifications. So you've got AQA's, learning objective, additional information, Edexcel's, their learning objective, and their getting started guide. You can see how detailed their getting started guide is for each specification point. And then OCR's, again with their learning objectives and their guidance. So that's all I wanted to discuss with you today. I hope you found this useful. Main thing to note is that you do not have to decide which exam board you are going to use until early 2022 when you make your entries. It's nice to have an idea of which one you're going for, and you can be thinking about the style of that exam, but if you change your mind, you can make that decision later. If you've committed to textbooks, physical textbooks for a specific exam board, it does make making that decision a little bit more difficult if you wanted to change. The textbooks are still valid for the content, but obviously they're focused on those exam boards. If you've bought electronic resources, then most suppliers like myself, like Craig and Dave, will quite happily let you switch to the other exam board, and so you're not stuck to their particular resources. But the main thing you're going to be doing is year 10 you're going to be teaching content, you're going to be teaching students about computer science. Year 11 is when you're going to start focusing on how it's going to work in an exam and the focus on the style of exams and the questions, etc. So do think about it carefully. Make your decision based on what is right for you and your students and your centre. Hope this has been helpful. I'm Paul Long.